Book of Acts, chapter 25. Acts chapter 25. We'll go ahead and begin reading at verse 1. We'll go down to verse 12 to begin with here. Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him, and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying in wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. When he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and made many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Ceasar have I offended anything at all. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. In this chapter, we find Paul still a prisoner of the Romans, and indeed he will eventually end up in Rome. And this chapter really gives us the human turning of events, if you will, of him being sent all the way to Rome. He could have been sent back to Jerusalem, but he chose to continue on in the Roman system. In this chapter, we find him first speaking before Festus. If you're keeping count, this is his fourth defense that he is given. This is quite the exhausting system that he's going through as he's being tried, as he's being brought from one person to another. And of course, these things are being drug out, and he's being brought before one person to the next. We find some things that are happening here. In verses 2 and 3, it says that the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. The high priest and the members of the Sanhedrin, they had brought charges against Paul. That's kind of where this whole thing had started, way back in Jerusalem. In chapter 23, you remember, there was a plot before in that chapter to kill him. If you go back to chapter 23, verses 12 and 13, it says, "And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. When they were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy." These individuals may have very well have been the same group that we read about in chapter 25, but I'm not sure. It's very probable. And so they tried first, here in chapter 25, to get Festus to release Paul back to them. And Festus says no. No, Paul needs to stay at Caesarea. But as we read through this, we were introduced to Festus. And Festus is a pretty important fellow here in chapter 25 and on into chapter 26. And so who was he? Who is this Festus? Well, Festus was a successor of Felix as the procurator of Judea. This is mentioned in the previous chapter, chapter 24, verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So Festus has inherited Felix's problem, and that is Paul. Okay? Smith's Bible Dictionary says that Festus was sent by Nero, probably in the autumn of AD 60. And a few weeks after Festus reached his province, he heard the case of Paul, who had been left a prisoner by Felix in the presence of Herod Agrippa II and Bernice, his sister. And we'll get to some of that as we get on into chapter 25. Judea was in the same disturbed state during the procuratorship of Festus, which had prevailed through that of his predecessor. He died in the summer of AD 62, having ruled the province of less than 2 years. So his significance historically isn't that great. He only had power for a couple of years. And as a matter of fact, this is for all you history buffs out there, the only historical references that we find so far about Festus are in the book of Acts, written by Luke, the historian, the doctor, as he wrote this book, and also in Josephus. Those are the only two references that have been uncovered so far mentioning Festus. Verse number 5 here says, "Let them therefore," said he, "which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him." So the agreement was made that the Jews should come there rather than Paul being sent back to Jerusalem. This is what Festus wanted. He's like, "No, I'm not sending him back to Jerusalem. If you want to accuse him, you come here." In verses 6 through 8, "And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all." So we see that the Jews have come back. They've stepped into the room. They've stepped into this Roman courtroom to once again accuse Paul. And it's the same story, the same song and dance that they did before. They've accused him of breaking the law of the Jews. They've accused him of breaking the law of the temple, or the law of God, and they've accused him of breaking the law of they've accused him of breaking the law of Caesar, the Roman law. He had not profaned the temple. He had not caused an insurrection. He had not started another sect of the Jews. None of those things. And that's why Luke, as he writes this under the inspiration of the Spirit, he mentions that they made these accusations. They made these grievous complaints against Paul, these many and grievous complaints, which they could not prove. You see, beloved, this is the way that people are. When you're standing on the Word of God, standing for the things of the Scriptures, people will hate you. They will try and bring accusations against you. The world will do these sorts of things. And even if it means that there are things that they cannot prove, they will bombard you with these things. And you think of it this way. They're throwing things at you hoping that something will stick. Like spaghetti on the wall. Maybe eventually it'll stick. And Paul answered for himself. He brought his own defense here. Neither against the law of the Jews, verse 8, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. My life is clean. You see, we understand this. When you're brought to trial in our country, it's the same thing. Innocent unless proven guilty. The burden of proof is on them. They've got to prove something. They've got to show the right evidence, and they can't prove it. But Festus was willing to do the Jews a pleasure. And he says to Paul, he says, "Wilt thou go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things which before me?" Now, it's not clear from the text, from this verse, whether he meant that he was willing to transfer the trial from Caesarea to Jerusalem, or to completely turn over jurisdiction of the case, to turn Paul over to the Jews and let them determine his fate. But looking at verse 9, or rather verse 9, from verse 10, it seems like, in Paul's answer, and then said, Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. He's been brought up on trumped-up charges. This should have been the end of the story according to our trial system, but we know how that sometimes goes anyway. But according to the Roman system, this thing's going to be carried on. And so now the question is, does it go back to Jerusalem or does it stay in Caesarea? Does it get carried on with the Romans all the way to Caesar? Which would you choose? Paul was a Jew by birth, but he was also a Roman citizen. The Roman government wasn't exactly benevolent, but neither were the Jews. They've tried twice to kill him, and even more than that, because remember, in every town that he went into, he was beat up, whipped up, strung up, and whatever, many times by the Jews. Talk about being between a rock and a hard place. So Paul's response seems to indicate that Festus was ready to turn the whole thing over to the Jews, and Paul says, no. No. I stand at Caesar's judgment seat. I have not broken any Jewish law. And so he said, I should be judged by the Romans to Caesar. I appeal to Caesar, he says. Verse 11, he says, if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. If I've done something worthy of death, I'm ready to die. And these Jews were obviously ready to kill him even without a trial. And so he appealed to Caesar. Well, verse 12, then Festus, when he conferred with the council, answered, hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. Not every trial, not every appeal to Caesar was approved. But what we have here is Festus conferring with his council and the approval happening. And things were set into motion now that had been set in motion long before Paul had ever even been born. Long before Caesar had ever been born. Long before there was ever a Roman Empire. Paul is going to Rome. To stand before Caesar. And so, verses 13 through 22 says, and after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, excuse me, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. To whom I answered, It is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth, against whom, when the accuser stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. So we see King Agrippa visits Festus, and Festus tells Agrippa about Paul. And you can see here in this retelling of what happens that Augustus, or rather Festus, as he recounts what took place, he includes in there about how that Paul told the Jews about Jesus, that there was a disagreement about Jesus, that they knew he was dead, but Paul affirmed was alive. Indeed, the Romans had been a part of that as well. But Jesus had met Paul on the road to Damascus. And Paul, every chance he got, and every opportunity he got, he witnessed of the resurrection of Christ. Agrippa heard of this Paul, and he says, I'd like to hear for myself. Who is this Agrippa? Agrippa, this King Agrippa, is Agrippa II. He's the son of Herod Agrippa I, according to Nelson's Bible Dictionary. He was the great-grandson of Herod the Great. He was appointed by the Roman Emperor Claudius as the ruler of Abilene, part of Galilee, Iturea, and Trachonitis. Now, in this passage, he's accompanied by Bernice. In fact, within the text, Bernice and Agrippa are inseparable. The name Bernice is based on the name Nike. Okay, we all have heard of Nike shoes, Nike clothing company. Nike is actually the goddess of victory. The name Bernice means one who brings victory, or perhaps victory comes. She was nominally Jewish, but her cultural orientation was largely Greek and to some extent Roman. She was born into wealth and privilege as a member of Herod's household. Now, this is where things get really interesting. She was married to her uncle, Herod of Chalcis, and became a widow at a young age. That's according to Josephus. She had a stormy relationship with Drusilla due to Drusilla's superior beauty. After Herod of Chalcis' death, Bernice attached herself to her brother Agrippa's court and was rumored to have an incestuous relationship with him. Paul would have been aware of these rumors, and it is likely that the original readers of Luke and Acts would have also known of these rumors. And so, when you read of these two being together, nothing is said explicitly, but it is suspicious of the two being together so much. And there's a backstory to it. Well, Festus set up a hearing before King Agrippa per his request. And so verses 23 through 27, and on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city, and Festus's commandment, Paul was brought forth. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, you see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. When I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, that he himself hath appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. So at the order of Festus, Paul is brought in where Agrippa and Bernice are. This is amid great pomp, in other words, much display, personal decorations. This is the way that they did things. They made a great show. They are, as I said, inseparable in the Bible account here. These two, Agrippa and Bernice. But Paul is given another opportunity to be able to tell his story. In other words, he's given an opportunity to witness to some more people. Festus says, look, these Jews, they're very outspoken against this Paul, that he shouldn't live any longer. Verse 25, he complains. He complains and says, I've not found anything whereby he should be put to death. And since he's appealed to Caesar. I'm sending him there. But I've got a problem. I'm not sure what the charges are. I don't know what to write. Sending Paul all the way to Rome, to Caesar, without a good backstory, without giving the charges for this Paul, would be foolish, if not dangerous, for Festus. And so Festus, being the provincial governor, having Agrippa examine Paul would be good. This would give him something to write. And maybe he could say, well, Agrippa was involved in this as well. And so this is where chapter 25 ends. As we think about these things and this back and forth between the Jews and the Romans and Paul being caught in the middle of it, I can't help but remember an earlier time. Time not too long before this, when something similar happened. In Matthew chapter 27, Matthew chapter 27 and beginning of verse 15 there. Now at that feast, the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would. They had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. When he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, Whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate saith unto them, What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? They all said unto him, Let him be crucified. And the governor said, Why, what evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. And Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made. He took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. Then released he Barabbas unto them. And when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Now, obviously, Paul was not Jesus. But you see how that there was back and forth between the Jews and the Romans here. But something else in all of this, get beyond the political things and all the political pressures and the Roman government and the Jewish politics and all of those things. Get beyond all of that and realize that the whole reason why Paul was in this situation in the first place was because he was a Christian. Paul was a follower of Christ. Indeed, the Jews as well as the Romans saw Paul as the leader of Christianity. the one who was spearheading the effort of spreading the gospel message beyond the borders of Israel. In Acts chapter 23, when Paul first was captured there with the Jews, you remember it? Acts chapter 23. Verse 6. He said, "But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees, the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, 'Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I'm called in question.'" What is that hope? What is that hope? That hope is Jesus. You see, Paul was there because of the resurrected Christ. And because he lives, so we live, and will live even after we're dead. Jesus had said it this way as we bring this to a close in John chapter 15. John chapter 15. In verse 18. "If the world hate you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were of the world would love his own. But because you're not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you." As the people of God and as the representatives of Christ, as the servants of Jesus, you and I will run into trouble with the world. Indeed, there will be people who will want to maybe even kill us for the cause of Christ. Shouldn't surprise us. It's the way it is. We're not of this world. Paul was not of this world. And all we can do as we live here for whatever time we've got is be a witness. Whether we're in front of people who are calm, cool, and collected, or in front of people who despise the message. Whether we're in front of authorities or in front of common people, in front of Jews, Romans, or Greeks, the message is the same. May God help us to be faithful in proclaiming that message. Thank you for your attention. May God add a blessing to his preaching of his word.